of, such as Michelle Bachmann, for instance, because they have not proposed actual solution. So when Ron Paul merely asserts that we don't really owe the debt to the Fed, and in truth the debt is handed off from the Fed, which then sells the securities that it just publishes evidence of promissory obligations, which we haven't even given our assent to. It sells these things. And so the debt is then owed to whoever purchases them. So this is why so much of our debt, likewise, is purportedly owed to China and other foreign governments and so on and so forth. Well, truth of the matter is, it's not China to whom we owe this money. It's the central banking system of China largely. True, individuals may buy this as well. But nonetheless, there is no reason even for these debts to exist. So anyone who purchases them is making a very bad risk. This then puts them in a political disposition of wanting to persist in the system of terminal failure so that they don't lose their bad investment. You see, and this is just one of many ways then that we become disposed against ourselves. So it's important for us to understand these things. It was important for us to understand them many years ago. And at this time, we have no further leeway to carelessly go on as if all of these inertias aren't mounting in some critical destruction of everything around us. We need to maintain our own sanity so that we can prevail again over the criminals who are against us. Now, when the commentators criticized the GOP debate immediately afterward, they pointed out that there was a little tiff between Mitt Romney and Rick Perry, where they each rebutted each other that they'd created more jobs than the other. And Romney had introduced his proposition first as being something that Mr. Obama would have been very envious of. Well, the truth of the matter, nonetheless, is that when the commentators came up with the math, it turned out that the jobs, as I've already mentioned, which have been created recently under the Obama administration, far outstrip what either governor was merely claiming. So the math is very poor. Nonetheless, what are we really talking about here in stimulus and job creation, which is not even rightly government business, which is actually only a consequence of the crimes against the people? What we're talking about here, or what they're really discussing, is if they're helping us, is removing some of the crime against us so that we can thrive some while on a very temporary and artificial sustenance, which actually conflicts with the very rules of the purported financial system itself, which rules preclude us exceeding veritable creditworthiness, and that, in other words, prevent us from assuming debts, beyond debts, we can't already have no hope of even servicing. We haven't had any hope of servicing further debt since Ronald Reagan was president and accumulated the most massive debts in history to that time, which, Newt Gingrich and others are nonetheless falsely portraying as successes. This is just persistence in a huge lie. Well, the issue here is that this job creation which is proposed and this economic stimulus which is proposed today exists in, even if it were to succeed, even if it were legitimate somehow, today it has to prevail over worse conditions than it would have before. So let's just start over again. Hypothetically, when Mitt Romney claims to have, had some kind of a business acumen which qualifies him to lead America to prevail as no one else is fit to do. Well, if that were in truth his skill set, he would have had, and I realize that these debates are not the proper forum for this because, you're limited in your responses. But even so, you would have to give at least a brief indication, which amounts to this. And that is, you would have to qualify what is the principle that's going to prevail in job creation or economic stimulus. To do that in any comprehensive way whatsoever, a person would have to establish how that stimulus would relieve us to a sustainable extent against an escalation of multiplication of falsified indebtedness to a banking system, which isn't even a banking system, which is merely a publisher of evidence of our own promissory obligations to each other. Worse then, to actually provide the American people or any people of any country of the world, the government would have to qualify or justify the obfuscation of the currency. So this fact that they cannot do that, there is no argument in history that justifies this obfuscation of the currency, reduces these pretenders, these potential figureheads of the banking system, to merely make these outlandish statements which are untruthful from their very foundations upward to whatever extent a false claim is made. If these men and women intended to serve us, they would have to hearken back to a justification of the obfuscation of the currency. What do we see then? What do we witness when we purportedly watch such an event? And the obfuscation of the currency is not even raised, not even by Ron Paul. How is it that every one of these candidates avoids the most crucial, fundamental issue of all, the obfuscation of the currency? There is no just or good explanation for how they do so, but that they intend themselves to persist in the crime. Now, as I respond to people on a regular basis. It's 7 days a week, 15 hours a day. I'm explaining the one and one only solution. A remarkable thing transpires, and that is Ron Paul supporters, who you would think would be the leading advocates of solution, are in fact the most resistant to solution. How could that be? They misunderstand themselves that Ron Paul is about, quote, ending the Fed. What do they mean by ending the Fed? Every discussion about Ron Paul, every comprehensive discussion about Ron Paul inevitably has to come back to this question. And so I'm forced over and over and over again to explain Ron Paul in Ron Paul's own words and in the documents of purported Austrian economists, which of course Ron Paul himself claims to be. Now, the whole Ron Paul thing comes down to this, that the banking system is comprised of two things: interest and manipulation of the volume of currency. Those two things. That's all banking really is. It's an obfuscation of the currency which comprises those two things: interest, which isn't justified, and a manipulation of the volume of the currency, including then its disposition, which means that, first they're laundering the principal unrightfully into their possession, and then of course they're multiplying sum of falsified indebtedness in relation to the principal that remains in circulation by interest, which forces this implicit obligation to maintain a vital circulation by borrowing principal and interest back into circulation, as increases the sum of debt perpetually by so much as ever greater sums of interest on an ever greater sum of debt until we suffer terminal failure. So that's banking. That's banking. And Austrian economists are advocates of banking and advocates of interest, and we've gone over this many, many times. So another thing that we really need to watch, and people who I talk to, if they're not a Ron Paul supporter, they're very suspicious of him. They know that, he's not offering, comprehensive answers. And a really good example of that existed in a less related issue about a fence across the border of, our southern states, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and Southern California. A fence across the entire border to prevent illegal immigration. Now, Ron Paul just refused to accept the idea of a fence, which is agreeable to myself as well. I mean, to think that we need fences across borders is... It conflicts with even, the most rudimentary feelings about, the world, how it should be divided up, how it should be different. Fundamentally, you have to wonder why there are different countries. Is there a different justice? And what Ron Paul we've got this tremendous, problem with, quote, illegal immigration, unquote. And we're trying to keep people out of the country because we can't afford to employ them, although they're willing to work for a tiny fraction of what we are and need in order to sustain our former standards of living here. So there's all these things wrong with this picture. And again, as engineers of a solution to a problem, we first have to identify what the problem is. That means we have to go back to its fundamental roots. We have to find what is the fundamental root of this problem. Then we have to come up with a solution, and we're only good engineers if we come up with an absolute solution, and it is